Welcome back to my channel, everybody. This has to be the most work I've ever put into doing an April Fool's Day joke on my friends, and I really wanted to make a Norse outfit. The whole idea for this outfit was that I really wanted to go through and be incognito at one of my local SCA events. So first things first, I needed to take some measurements, including across my shoulders, front and back, roughly. Also from my waist to the floor, and uh, my biceps, my arm length while it's bent, some more basic stuff like that. Uh, I'm not an especially talented sewist when it comes to tunics, nor am I well versed in Norse clothing in general compared to, say, my Italian Renaissance stuff or some of the other areas of interest I have. So I'm going to link a blog post that I used to figure out this tunic down in the description so that you guys can check it out straight from the horse's mouth from someone that does a lot more Norse flavored things than I do. Now, I have done outfits like this for other people and friends in the past, so it's not like this is my first rodeo with it. And in addition to that blog post, I'm also going to put some affiliate links for books and other resources that I have found helpful while I was trying to wrap my head around the clothing in this region and from this time period. So if you want to support us in a monetary way over at the channel, go ahead and click on those links and check out the books. Otherwise, now that my measurements are done, it's time to start laying out the pattern pieces and cutting out some fabric. Now, the fabric I used is a linen rayon blend rather than 100% linen. It's not that I didn't have access to the linen. I just really didn't want to have to deal with the amount of ironing that linen tunics can sometimes take. Ironing is one of my least favorite chores, and for something that I could wear as a standalone dress, I wanted to make sure that it was a little bit easier to wear in the future, just in case. For those of you who were watching my pink text video from a few weeks back, I'll go ahead and put that link up in the cards here as well. These are some of the tools that I have gotten from hardware stores in the past. A lot of rulers and squares, and they're really helpful when it comes to pattern drafting and trying to lay out garments like this that have a more rectangular construction and need a little bit more run space with your chalk than a normal 18-inch quilting ruler is going to give you. So, not saying you have to get them, but they are pretty handy if you're looking for something that has a little bit more length while you're laying out large pattern pieces from a diagram like this. The biggest drawback probably to trying to draw this all out on linen with a rayon blend to it was that the rayon blend made it a little bit more squishy, and so it would slide a little bit more than my normal 100% linen would do. But it ultimately didn't make that much of a difference while I had the fabric doubled over. Now, trying to figure out how to set up the doors with the side panel armpit-ish gusset things for this tunic was really obnoxious. I kind of just kept moving things around and doing some origami and folding things until I got something that I felt worked more or less pretty well. It turns out that this does waste a little bit more fabric than I was expecting it to, but you could go about doing it a couple other ways to get the shape of this gore. I would just recommend taking a look at what your options are. I am also really terrible at making keyhole necklines, so I cheated. I decided that after measuring out my neck measurement, I was going to find a saucer that would actually be the perfect size for this, and that turned out to be this one from my black and white teacups, just to make my life a bit easier when I set the actual tunic body down to make some adjustments for that neck. The side gores ended up having a little bit of a issue. Like I was saying, I'm gonna iron out the seams so that I can do some seam finishing. And there's also a tail that got created with the attachment method. It's that little triangle piece that you see up towards the top. Once I am done doing my seam finishings, that little extra piece is going to get cut off so that it's not in my armpit anywhere and it's not bulking up my sleeves or anything like that. When it came to getting my neckline to go into place, since I was doing the gussets and the neckline a bit simultaneously to save on time at the sewing machine, I found the exact center across my shoulder blades across my shoulder seam. I set the saucer back about 2 or 3 fingers width and centered it over the middle of this garment. Then I traced it out with some chalk and cut it out so we could sew a neckline. The placement of the saucer on this one, with it not being fully centered over the middle of the garment, means that I have enough room for the back of my neck, but at the same time, most of the neckline is going to come more forward the way it would on my normal clothing, and make it so that the slit for my keyhole neckline does not have to be nearly as long. It makes it for a much cleaner looking neckline, and definitely is something I would recommend giving a try if you are trying to do keyhole necklines yourselves. I just felt the need to double check my work by folding everything in half. Once it was centered and I knew it, I started cutting down a small slit to make my keyhole neckline. If you're doing this without a pattern like I was, I would recommend cut shorter than you think and go down from there. Because you can always cut down, you can't uncut the fabric and make your neckline a little more shallow if you cut it too deeply, if you understand what I'm saying. The shoulders ended up being a little bit too wide as well, so I cut a little bit off of the body panels after I was done with this. But I just took some chalk and continued that keyhole neckline down a little bit. They don't go super deep at this time period from everything I've seen, but it'd be nice if it was a little less of a struggle to get the tunic over my head.
Welcome to the fact that I sew and film in the middle of the night for most people. So here we are. I got part of this Norse dress put together, so I'm gonna pin, or probably safety pin, the armpits here in just a second, and we're gonna test fit that armpit just to make sure that I've got enough movement and everything, because after this step, when I do the final seam down the sides, it's going to be really hard to fix it if I don't take care of it now. As it is right now, I could still rip out the sleeve and do some recutting of that one puzzle piece going into this if I have to. So hang tight just a minute.
I also spent some time trying to get all of the side seams for these gussets and gores dealt with as best as I could before I started moving on to the next step. It just made life a lot easier as I started doing my side seams. And with a little bit of adjustment, the garment's a lot more wearable. The bicep ends up being a little bit tight. I adjusted it a bit from here, but probably not quite enough. I'll adjust that in my pattern for my next one of these should I make one. And I also needed to adjust my wrist in just a smidge. But once that was done, it moved pretty well. I was more or less happy with it. I also had cut the body panels down a bit from what I thought I would need because the side gores were giving me enough room all on their own. Once I got the tunic off, I needed to finish remarking all of the seams that I was going to have. I just marked my sewing lines, figuring I could go back and add the seam allowance I needed, but it'd be really hard for me to go back and find that stitching line again if I didn't mark it quickly. So even though the chalk won't last forever, it should last me long enough to get this side seam put together and through one of my sewing machines. One of the nice bits about this project is I kept having small hand sewing breaks. So I would go and I would sew together one of the panels, and then I would have a bunch of hand finishing to do some basic running stitches while I stitched down the seam allowance to almost create a flat filled seam. I used a silk to do this and just a wide embroidery needle. It has such a really cool sort of homespun looking felt. But when it comes to attaching the sleeves and the side gores to the body panels, one of the things that I needed to do was find the center of the top of the sleeve. So that's going to match up with the top of the shoulder. And then start attaching it slowly from the center out. It was a lot easier to do this once I put some of the pins in places on the seams, joining the shoulders to the side gores and the sleeves to the side gores. One of the trickier parts about doing these rectangular construction garments with the large side gores is trying to remember to put the bias edge of that side gore up against the straight green seams of the body. What that's going to do is help to stabilize all of the bias cut fabric on that long edge of your gore and keep it from stretching out and doing something weird. If you've ever seen a tunic that seems to point out like it's got wings at the hem, it's probably got two bias edges that are sewn together so they're stretching along that bias line from the weight of the garment pulling it down. But when you do that with the straight of grain, it just keeps everything from pulling strangely. But you do kind of have to ease that bias line into the straight. So mine was just a smidge longer than probably needed to be. And I started on either end from the top of the shoulder to the bottom. I kind of worked my way down in each direction until everything lined up exactly the way I wanted. This project was also really easy to do big bulk sewing batches. So I would do a large amount on my sewing machine, and then I could go and sit down and do a large amount of hand sewing. So let's enjoy a little bit of sewing machine time. And I will never ever fault anybody who decided that they wanted to sew their garment on the machine rather than by hand. We've all got different abilities and different reasons we might be sewing on a machine instead. So if that's what you're going to do, awesome. If you want to sew it completely by hand, totally cool. Do what's going to make your little heart happy. With a large amount of my machine sewing done, I sat back down to keep working on hand finishing all of these edges. I chose to use a silk that I got from Tied to History. I'll put their website down in the description as well. It was a slubbier Alluri silk. It was more like a raw silk embroidery floss, which I thought gave a really great effect for this project. And to prep those seams, I'm going to iron everything open first. That way it's got a nice crisp edge and I'm not worried about the seam trying to bubble up inside of my stitching. Nothing's quite as bad as trying to keep your fabric from not bubbling when it's supposed to lay flat. From my understanding, they did have some what we believe are ironing stones during the Viking Age. So I totally used my current electric iron, but feel free to do what's going to make you happy. I did need to spend a little extra time pressing some of the previously felled seams just because they were a little bit bulkier, and so it took a little bit more steam to get them to lay open nicely. But it wasn't something that was impossible. It just took a little bit of extra time and some extra patience. If this video's been super helpful to you, I would really appreciate it if you'd hit that thumbs up button. And if you want to see the next steps in my April Fool's Day project that I made, feel free to hit that subscribe button while you're over there. I'm hoping to get the part 2 to this project up really quickly so that I can share the overdress that goes on top of this tunic with all of you soon. Once I got all of the seam finishes pressed open, I also went through and just tucked the little zigzag stitched edges that I had done underneath and started doing a large running stitch or a small basting stitch, depending on how you want to think about it. Either way, I would rung up a bunch of these stitches and then I would kind of pet the seam to make sure everything equaled out and nothing got too bunched up beyond what I decided was an acceptable amount of bunching. It does ease up quite a bit once the garment's been washed. But initially I wanted to make sure there was enough ease that it didn't get bunched even more when it got washed later on. I know it's really popular to have a lot of complicated seam finishes on some of the tunics from this era from reenactors, and I kind of asked some of my friends about it that do a lot more from this time period. Their general thought was it was far more likely to have something that was slightly decorative but like 90% functional, sort of like these stitches, rather than having purely decorative stitches on top of something. I figured I would humor them since this is the first one of these outfits that I'm going to be having, and I don't plan on having a bunch of them around. But you'll see on my apron dress, I go a little bit more crazy. And even with the stitches being really simple and 90% functional on the tunic, the overall effect when you look at all of these tiny stitches being top stitching that holds the seam allowance in place to keep it from fraying, it's just kind of magical, honestly. I love the look of it. I love the contrast of the oranges and yellow silk to the red linen rayon blend. I just couldn't be happier with these choices. If you like this choice, go ahead and tell me about it in the comments. Or if you've got a favorite combination or set of seam treatment stitches that you use on tunics like this, I would also love to hear about that and see what other people's thoughts were. So, for me, the intimidation factor when it comes to doing keyhole necklines has always been a real thing. Probably comes back to one of the first garments I was ever asked to make for somebody had one of these, and I bombed it epically, like epically bad. It sat really wide, they got sunburns. Tim, if you're out there, I'm so very sorry that I bombed the neckline on your tunic. Since then, I have figured out this method for trying to get my tunic necklines to work almost no matter what shape they're going to be. And I take a square of the neck facing fabric that I'm going to use. In this case, it's just more of the red linen rayon blend. And I'm going to pin it over all of the neckline itself. That way the neckline's completely covered and it has some extra seam allowance at the top and the bottom to make sure that I'm not cutting my facing too short. After that, I'm going to lay everything out and start trying to work on basting. So the basting is going to keep the curve from stretching out as I'm working with the neckline. It just makes my whole life a little bit easier when I'm doing these. I know some people that would just pin really close to the neck hole at this point and go through it through their machine. I find that because on these tunics I'm working with such a wide piece of fabric, it makes my life so much easier if there's actually some stitches in place to hold everything down. Otherwise, stuff tends to stretch, especially on something that has any give or any sort of a bias, like the curve of a neckline. Just in case you're not familiar with what I mean by a basting stitch, it's basically a really long straight stitch with really wide stitches that you're going to use to hold things in place. I'm not worried about it being particularly short or strong, and that's because it's ultimately going to get cut out. There are other instances where you might just sew your basting directly into the garment and not worry about it. It's going to depend on the situation and where it's at. This is a little bit deep into my seam allowance, so it might make more sense for me to take it out in some places, but not necessarily all the way around. So, just to kind of keep things in perspective, it makes life a lot easier and it's going to save me from having a lot of pins stabbing me later. Taking these basting stitches all the way down to the point of my keyhole and then coming back up and addressing the top points of the keyhole neckline also help to keep those in place because they are notorious for wiggling on me at least. So if you're worried about something like that shifting on you and having an uneven neckline, I would also highly recommend just basting around the edges of it before you start sewing. if you are one of those people like me that despises getting stabbed in the lap when you're trying to sew something, basting is going to be your best friend because it means that there's thread holding everything down and you don't have to keep all those pins in place. You can actually take them out and then go sew. Before I could get sewing, I needed to cut the neckline out a bit. I did a really wide seam allowance while I was cutting this and tried to get it roughly lined up with the inner edge of the neckline below, but I was willing to give myself grace on this first pass to just get the center hole out of the neckline and make room for me to be able to stitch around it and kind of see what I was doing. Because this project is all about let's do a big batch of machine sewing all at once and then get back to the pretty relaxing hand sewing, I also needed to trim back the cuffs and the sleeves a bit. I did get a tiny nick somehow in one of my sleeves, which I'm just going to address with doing a couple extra whip stitches around it once everything's assembled. It makes life a little bit easier. I also used the cut off from the other sleeve as a guide to get roughly the right amount on the other sleeve marked out and cut down. It's not always exact, but it gets me really close, so for a quick and easy tunic, I'll take it. Once I was done sewing the neckline down through the sewing machine, I then decided to go around it and start doing a little bit of clipping around that curve. That way it would stretch where I needed it to and relax around my neck a little bit easier. I highly recommend clipping your curves and trying to cut notches out of points just to make your life easier, but just keep in mind that clipping these does not mean going all the way through the seam allowance. I usually try to think of it as stopping about halfway between the edge of my fabric and seam allowance. And if I need to go deeper, I can, but I'm making a very conscious choice at that point versus accidentally having my scissors slip and then having to redo facing all over again. This project is probably going to be one of those where you really wish I didn't tell you over and over again to go and iron flat a seam, but it's one of the projects I've worked on where it's the most essential to try and keep everything working the way you want it to. So once I had clipped all the edges, I put the neck facing the other direction so that I would have a lovely finished edge and started pressing that facing down. And inevitably, as always happens when I do these keyhole necklines, I did a few too many stitches than I needed, and it's kind of bunching up at the point. I just solve it by unpicking 1 or 2 stitches on either side, maybe clipping just a tiny bit on the inside of that seam. As needed, it's just going to be kind of a matter of clipping and taking a look around. I'm sorry I'm not being more precise with instructions on how to fix that little bunching spot on a tunic. You might notice I actually use a lot of different tools to try and address this between the iron, the seam picker, my tiny little embroidery snips. It's really just a matter of use what gets the job done. I don't know if there was any single piece that was best. But once I got that down, the neckline is almost done and it looks so gorgeous. I opted to do a 2-inch facing all the way around the finished neckline edges. So I just used my quilter's ruler, put it at that point, and then started drawing out my edges. I allowed these to be a little bit unspecific and then connect the dots almost between drawing some dashes. Having it be this wide is going to give me the room to be able to adjust things and to turn the edge underneath and stitch it down. It's not going to be so narrow that I'm worried about the edges of the neck facing flopping out into the neckline. And this is where I can finally cut down all of this excess fabric. I know it's going to be a little bit wasteful compared to being able to just have a pattern piece to cut out, but it also lets me customize that neckline and that neck facing a bit. So if I wanted a squared off facing, I could do that a little bit more easily, just like I did with customizing the width of my keyhole neckline in this one. Do you have a favorite way of doing these keyhole necklines? I would also love to hear about that. Maybe I've just been going about this in one of the most complicated ways in the world, and that's why I've always intimidated by them. One of the other things I have found helps me quite a bit is I'm going to clip around the edge of this keyhole neckline facing. That way everything stretches just a tiny bit and lets me tuck everything underneath to do more of my top stitching and keep that raw edge encased just that little bit more. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little bit nervous to get this neck facing put in place because it was going so well that I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Rather than trying to go back and base this down again, I opted for pins. And I just went around the edge of the outside of my facing and pinned things in. That way all the raw edges would be encased while I started sewing down the neckline. I did opt to sew the neckline down by hand to make sure that it continued with the same patterns that I had used through the rest of the tunic. For me, some of the hardest bits of doing running stitches on this tunic had to be doing the inner edge of my neckline. Not only was that edge right along my neck going to be the top fabric and the neck facing, but it was also all of the fabric that was in that seam allowance. So there was an extra layer or two, depending on how the fabric got rolled, to try and sew through. I went back and forth between using my thimble to push the needle through, to trying that silicone pedal thing that I've used in a bunch of my videos. It just sort of depended on where my physical strength was at that point in the evening, with what I chose to use more forcibly to get through that. Um, I also found that the fabric would bunch a little bit as I was running those running stitches through. It may have had something to do with the way I was putting the stitches onto the needle as like a bead reamer almost, and pulling the thread tight, but I then found myself going and petting the stitches back into place to make sure that it didn't stay bunched up. I wanted to keep that tension as even as I could because that's part of the overall appeal of doing this as a decorative stitch. It- The evenness and the regularity of those stitches and the lack of bunching really add to it really for texture. I thought that pivoting the stitches to go down the straight of my neckline was actually really easy. I went to about the same seam allowance that I'd been using between my stitches and the outer edge. And then once my stitches were close enough to that edge to be about the same seam allowance, I turned the next stitch downwards and started following the straight instead of trying to follow the curve all the way around. Made my life super easy, and it was kind of easy to gauge kind of the stitch length, I guess you could say. Doing the outer edge of the neckline was fiddly because there were pins holding the raw edges in place, but it wasn't quite as physically demanding, especially once I cut out some of the excess fabric and some of my corners right here at the point. Once that was out of the way, the fabric laid much nicer and was a lot thinner to try and stitch through instead of going through all of those layers all at once. So now that you're seeing how much hand sewing I actually put into this dress, partially because I'm just that kind of geek that loves to do those stitches, but also because I wanted to do really, really good Norse outfits for this prank I was playing. What's the farthest you've ever gone to for a prank? 'Cause this has to be a new record for me with the hours of hand stitching these decorative top seams into an outfit that, while I do end up loving it, I was really questioning my choices right about here as I'm trying to sew down this neckline, and my side seams weren't even assembled yet. As usual, stitching through one of my prior felled seams is a little bit harder than sewing through the rest of the fabric, but it's something that with my thimble, I'm able to easily maneuver around and then keep sewing the garment. So just keep that in mind if you're going to sew this by hand. You might want to invest in a really good thimble to help you force your needle through if you're going to use a grabby silk like this thread is. No matter how much I had actually pinned down my neckline, every once in a while, because I clipped the edge, it would sort of peek out in a weird spot, so I would have to go back and tuck those in. So keep that in mind too if you do a clipped edge on your keyhole neckline's outer edge. And yes, I am wearing my tunic inside out while I'm trying it on to see how much I like it. I ended up doing the same stitches to my rolled hem, and I did the same thing on my cuffs. It's just a simple rolled hem that I then top stitched down with more of the silk. I think this one was a slightly lighter dye lot than what I'd originally started with doing side seams, but you can't really tell with the way the stitches end up getting broken up with thread. The cuff was super basic and simple, and then I'm done. So thank you so much for watching this section of the video. Again, if you want to see what I do with the apron dress, go ahead and click that subscribe button. And I have to run off to go finish editing part 2 of this series. I'll see you soon. Bye.